of head. So you use that to measure from the other characters. The opposite case is a fully mature character. Now, the general rule is toddlers are about 3 heads tall. That's usually super deformed, aka chibi in anime style. At that point, their heads basically, they're basically a bobblehead at that point. They have, little arms and limbs that wiggle around, but that's basically the gist of it. So here's sort of a show of what that would look like. In this case, I think this character is actually 2 heads tall. So that's even more. This is genuine bobblehead, and this one's 3 heads tall. So chibi characters in that range go into this. But chibi isn't just about making a character baby size. There are a few exaggerations, which I'll be showing in today's course. A more mature character, usually the most anime will normally go to is about 7 heads tall. That's about supermodel height. That's like a professional, a very tall person, like an NBA basketball player height, right? In anime, it doesn't usually go over that. Usually the bodybuilder type characters have that. In Western comics, Marvel comics, superhero stuff, you often see characters with even more drastic proportions, like 9 heads tall, because you usually see, muscle-bound, buff superheroes, right? But you don't see that too often unless you have like a genuinely evil character who's basically a tank, right? So that's not too big of an issue. But basically, whenever you draw a character and are trying to remember how high they should be, always go by the head. And the general, most characters, that is adolescent, if you're going by anime tropes, the adolescent high school going, teenager is about 5 heads tall. That's usually the standard for most anime characters, is about 5 heads going into 6 heads tall. So at that point, after that, it kind of exaggerates. So the average is about 5 heads, basically. And this doesn't count the hair. When you draw the hair, it gives the illusion the head is bigger than it is. So you're thinking of it in full size. And there are complex curves. When drawing complex curves, the secret is to look where you're going, not where your pencil is. And this isn't really important when you're sketching, because when you're sketching, you can always erase it and flesh it out, right? It's more important when it comes to inking. In inking, you kind of have one shot, unless you're working digitally, in which case you have infinite shots. So that does help. But basically, another thing you want to also consider is your wrist and arm movement. A lot of people, when they start drawing first, they're very finger focused or wrist focused, one of the two. And there is actually such thing as a proper pencil grip. And if you guys notice, I don't use it. This is the proper pencil grip. They call it the tripod grip. And I don't use it. I use something I like to call the scalpel grip, which is how a doctor holds a scalpel, like this. It doesn't matter. Honestly, it doesn't matter. If you're comfortable with it, it's good. I like the scalpel grip, as I call it, because it's good for doing fluid arcs, right? That's something that I have trouble doing with the tripod grip. But another thing to take into account is your elbow and your shoulder too. Your shoulder is not as important when you're working on a small piece of paper like this, but the bigger your drawing is, the more you're going to rely on your shoulder. The important thing is to get your whole arm moving when trying to draw a smooth line. And as I mentioned before, you don't have to worry too much about that when doing the sketch factor of it. You don't have to nail it on your first tries. The purpose of the sketch, of course, is to make it look good first and worry about the line work later. But it's something good to keep in mind when drawing. Okay, so next up is off symmetry. Now this one's a fairly common mistake. It usually happens in drawing the faces of characters, because as I mentioned with the emotions, nothing looks more wrong than the face that's asymmetrical. So in this case, I'll just draw a character's face, a 3/4 face probably. Now 3/4 faces have a certain difficulty to them in that you have to account for symmetry, even though the face is at an angle. The reason why you always see me drawing these lines here as guides is they're known what I would call center lines. They basically indicate the center of the shape. So whenever I draw an object like I think I should draw a ball is a good example, I guess. A ball. The center lines here are there to indicate basically where the center axis of it is. It's very important when drawing characters. So if I draw this line off, it's not the end of the world. I can just fix it later, right? But the features, in this case, I'm going to try actually drawing it off intentionally. Now, I mentioned before that the eye width apart from each other does constitute the character's personality. The further the eyes are apart, the more relaxed they look like, and the closer they are, the more nervous they look. But the perfect, according to human anatomy generalists, distance is 1 eye apart. So when you have no preference for making a character one way or another, you can't go wrong by making the distance between both of their eyes 1 eye apart from each other. So in this case, I'm doing the character's face actually symmetrically correct. But if I was to make a mistake and say drew this line off and did the eye like here instead on the side, This is what would be a symmetrical failure. Later on when I draw the eye and fill it in, it's going to look completely off because it's not taking into account the center line. So although it's a pain to draw, you have to erase it eventually, it gets in the way of things. The center line will save you tons of work. Every bit in the sketch phase, when you're planning to yourself where things should go, will save you twice as much time when you actually come to drawing it. So on full face drawings, that is when the character is looking directly at you, it matters even more because you can't get around perspective basically. And another part of this is perspective basically. So I'm just going to talk very quickly about perspective because perspective is a classical drawing aspect. It's not unique to anime. Everything that involves light in drawing, which is everything pretty much, because drawing is basically the emulation of how light behaves on objects. Anything that is anything that you can see involves perspective. And there's basically 4 ways of drawing perspective, and it's this sort of traditional method that people do. The first method is known as 0-point perspective. 0-point perspective is a cheat. It doesn't exist in real life. It's mathematically impossible. What 0-point perspective is when you're lazy and you draw 2 things. I shouldn't use the word lazy. When you're practical, you draw 2 things and you base 2 shapes and you link them without taking into account proper perspective, which is fine. This is great when you're drawing characters, because on characters, the distance of perspective is so small unless you're doing massive foreshortening. Foreshortening is what happens when a character's one part of their body is drastically drawn larger than the other because it's much closer. Similar to how my fist here, I hope my fist is larger on the camera that I'm showing, is much larger than the rest of me perspective-wise. So unless a person is doing foreshortening, extreme perspective doesn't come into play. As such, a person can draw something like a magical gem quite easily without having to worry about being in proper perspective. So I'll just draw this here. It's kind of crude, but it's a good point. So this is just drawing this here. And it doesn't have to be proper perspective. No one's going to check. No one's going to take out a ruler and say that's correct or not. It looks good enough. It looks 3-dimensional enough, and that's good enough. So that's 0-point perspective. It might... Can I show? Yeah, I can actually. I'll save paper, save a few trees. I'm sure some trees died during the process of this course. Okay, so 1-point perspective is used mostly for backgrounds. It's called 1 point because the 1 point here is the vanishing point. The vanishing point is best described as the furthest thing you could see from your direct line of sight that's right in between your eyes. Actually, it's basically just think of it as the furthest point you can see. That. Forget about the right between your eyes thing. That's just complicates things. So 1-point perspective is really useful for drawing alleyways. So basically, I'm just going to draw this here. Oh, I forgot to draw the horizon line. The horizon line is also important. This is the horizon line is basically where the ground meets the sky. So it's important to note this here. So in this case, I'm just going to draw a few rectangles here. And these will be my buildings. Now, 1-point perspective means you don't have to worry about the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis in this case. I only need to worry about where these lines intersect. So within where these lines intersect is where my lines meet. So if I want to draw a house, it'd look sort of like this. A building, and put windows here, and I'll just draw this here. Now, if you were being really OCD about it, you take out a ruler and make sure everything's exact. It's actually a lot easier to do this on a computer, even in a program like Photoshop that's not necessarily 3D, because of course programs like that have a perfect rulers, right? Which makes it a lot easier, right? So this is useful for drawing houses and the like. Now, I'll be showing 2-point perspective. I probably won't go too much in 3-point perspective though. Okay, so 2-point perspective is good for drawing a single building. Forget about alleyways. It's horrible at